Fabulous. Emily and Melissa, thanks. I'll introduce you shortly. And we have Upton and Sarah and Joe. So I think the only one you might be missing is Doug. Unless, no, I don't think so. There's Doug. Okay, fabulous. Why don't we get started again? Hi again. I was introduced in absentia in a way at the beginning of the meeting, but I'm Steve Pearson. I'm the founder and now special advisor at ICER, and it's my great privilege to take this discussion forward into what we call our policy roundtable, where we've been spending a lot of time talking about the evidence, the effects on patients and their families, the context around the need and the effects beyond health, which is a very important discussion. And now we're going to pivot to really think forward, and we're going to talk about how this all gets applied in the real world of delivery, of patient education, of insurance coverage, of the pricing and the out-of-pocket payments, and the future research. So we're going to try to cover all of that in an hour and a half. And it's, again, a great pleasure to continue to be working with our patient experts and clinical experts from earlier in the day. And we have two new members to introduce to this discussion. So with the next slide, I think we should be able to see the full list. So again, we have Upton. By the way, my personal approach is to call everybody by their first name. I think it's been a very polite and proper meeting, and there's nothing wrong with last names and titles, but with your permission, I hope you will also call me Steve. We have Upton and Sarah, our clinical experts. We have Joe and Doug, our patient experts. And I'd like to introduce Emily Sau and Melissa Posatrigo. Why don't you guys just introduce yourselves and mention again if you have any specific financial conflicts of interest. Emily, you first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and I am a clinical pharmacist at Premier Blue Cross. We're a regional health plan with 2 million lives in Washington, Alaska, and I oversee drug medical policies. And my only conflict is that I am a full-time employee of Primera.
Thank you again for being with us. Melissa, is this your first ICER meeting, or have you done one before?
I've actually had the privilege of doing one before. It was for CAR-T and multiple myeloma.
Oh, wow. That
I'm
was
honored
back
to
in
be
the
here
day.
again. Yeah.
Now, but a very interesting arc to continue that on then. So please introduce us to your role and your background.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to be here today. So I work at OncoHealth. OncoHealth is a digital care management and utilization management company. We work specifically in the oncology sector, just with oncology medications, working with over 18 payers, over 12 million member lives. During my time at OncoHealth, I've had the opportunity to do pharmacy consulting with payers, writing drug policies, participating in research with real world data. And at the moment, the majority of my time is spent in utilization management.
So not to put too fine a point on it, but basically, are you asked to come in and make sure that all the oncologists in the insurers network aren't prescribing, the wrong drug to the wrong patient at the wrong time? You're supposed to help manage both the quality and the costs of care. Is that the broad mission?
Yes, I would say yes, correct. So not so much checking to make sure that everyone's dotting their I's or crossing their T's, but just making sure that the medications are being used in the right lines of therapy, just to ensure that the patients aren't incurring costs for a therapy that maybe is not being used in the right setting, right? We want to make sure that we're mindful of the costs that patients are feeling with these very expensive medications.
Great. Okay, well, I thank your background and thank you again for being part of a second ICER meeting. I think we can take down this slide now just so it's easier to see everybody's face when we're talking to each other. Okay, so boy, there are a lot of places we could start. We almost always start our discussions thinking about health equity and the steps that different stakeholders should take to try to get this right as we introduce what is very likely going to be an FDA-approved treatment soon into clinical practice. But even before that, I was just going to note, I found it very interesting, the clinical evidence that was discussed this morning that was rated an A, which is ICER's highest evidence rating, reflects a situation that we don't always or even often see, which was, 50%, around 50% of patients benefit tremendously, let's say, from the effects of treatment. And the 50 who do not respond obviously get either no benefit or very little benefit. It's not like everybody gets a little bit or that there's a smooth bell curve. And the ethicists of the world will always be able to pose an interesting or tough question to the clinical experts. What if it was 1 to 5% of people who got a lot of benefit, and you had to treat 100 people to see 2 or 3 get this benefit at this price? What should we do with that situation? We don't have that situation, right? It's 50% of people are getting a big benefit, and we will talk about the price. But oncology is an interesting area in which sometimes we do see these very stochastic response curves in which some patients get a tremendous benefit. And it raises some interesting clinical and ethical questions. The other thing I was going to ask, and I really do wish the drug company was here to help us with this perspective, but Sarah or Upton, how broad is this approach potentially going to go? I mean, we're talking about its use for one form of, PTLD. One of the reasons that ICER did a review of it is because it is one of the very first allogeneic off-the-shelf approaches. And Sarah, it was a great lead-in because you pointed out the arc of innovation here is really tremendous as we move more in this direction. Are we talking about this approach being used, across the CAR T space, across different kinds of approaches here? Or how narrow will it stay? Not necessarily just this one treatment, obviously, but 5 years from now, are we going to wake up and see this general approach being used a lot more broadly in oncology? Sarah
Yeah,
or Upton, what do you think?
Yeah, so one is, in terms of tab-cel, the allele trial was specific to EBV-driven post-transplant lymphoproliferative disease, right? EBV PTLD. What some folks on the call may be aware of is that there are active ongoing trials in other EBV-related diseases, right? So I think if you're asking, is tab-cel under this label likely also to be tab-cel under other indications in the future? I think the answer is possibly. You can imagine that many of the EBV-driven diseases are rare disease entities in and of themselves, right? And if we're dealing with pediatric immunodeficiencies, or we're dealing with HAV positive immunosuppressed patients, right? They each may react a little differently. So my hope as a clinician and as an EBV immunologist for decades is that yes, we will see applicability in PTLD and in other viral diseases. We do know, however, that whereas tab-cel really is EBV focused, there have been other efforts in the scientific cell therapy community which have not yielded efficacy against other viruses like adenovirus. Some have, and then the registration trials were negative for efficacy, though no toxicity, right? So I think that we're actually at a crossroads. I believe that antiviral CTL therapy does have a home. I think the home it will start in is EBV PTLD. I think it will grow, but I can't give you a good roadmap because we had some surprises within the past 2 years in terms of data. Upton, what is your perspective?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree 100%. I believe it will inevitably grow because there are a number of diseases where once you reach a certain point, there are no other options. And already the options are incredibly limited. So Sarah made reference to adenoviral disease in immunosuppressed patients. And that's pretty more or less, untreated is as a high, fatality. And we don't have effective drugs to treat that. So another is drug-resistant cytomegalovirus infection. Another is BK virus disease. So where we don't have drugs that are specifically able to target those viral illnesses. So I think that the concept that is presented here by Tab-cel is cutting edge and really represents what could best be seen as the next frontier in terms of a more personalized, targeted approach to the treatment of a number of diseases, some of which we have zero options, to use to treat them.
And you had mentioned,
Go ahead,
Steve,
sir.
you'd mentioned oncology, and I
Mhm.
would actually say that these therapies, the antiviral CTLs, are really in the immunocompromised space, right?
I see
Which
what you.
is oncology patients because we do it to them, right? Is organ transplant patients because we do it to them. But you can even have autoimmune disease patients, right? Who get BK or who get JC virus. So it's a whole field, but it's not just oncology.
I can see why you guys are excited about it. And again, I mean, we do try to pick drugs that we think have a high likelihood of reaching the FDA approval stage for multiple reasons. And this one seems like a relative slam dunk, given its safety profile and the benefits that accrue, again, around 50% of the people. So let's talk about how it rolls out in January. Now, again, Sarah and Upton, you were helpful in, I think, starting to talk about the ways that this is going to be delivered into the system, and maybe in the early days, Sarah, as you said, it'll be kind of a hub and spoke approach, or maybe just a hub approach at the beginning. I mean, we're talking about just a few hundred patients who are already plugged into their transplant centers, as you said. But our standing question of all stakeholders is, what needs to happen so that the US healthcare system doesn't do what it usually does, which is to send the best new treatments to the people who are plugged in at the academic centers, who tend to be wealthier, whiter, et cetera, and may have less out-of-pocket problems. And we will talk about costs. But what comes to mind, if anything, around the mechanism through which this drug will be distributed and used? We'll talk about prior auth too, but please feel free to free associate, starting with Sarah and Upton, around what can happen. And then I want to hear from the patients on this as well.
Yeah, so my free association, which I think I brought up before, was standardization. And as the manufacturer rolls this out and looks thoughtfully at what does the center need to do to be able to request this therapy appropriately and to deliver and monitor the after effects safely, that they be realistic, right? And
I'm trying to be as concrete as possible. If we were to
so
write
one
this
of the
down, we
things
don't want to
might
say
be,
be realistic.
yeah,
What is
do they only go to transplant centers? And
okay?
again, my personal bias is that's where it will start because they have all the data, right? But if they're thinking we'd like to improve the access in terms of what what infrastructure resources are needed at a minimum to keep these cells safe, right? What is needed to physically infuse the patients? I would say that thinking creatively about maybe you don't need the whole infrastructure of a transplant center. What actually bodies and equipment do you need? And make that as simple as possible within safety parameters. And then also, if we're talking about getting this outside of the transplant centers, how does that manufacturer's portal facilitate communication? Because so far in the commercial cell therapy space, this sounds mundane, but every company has its own portal, its own logins, its own way it appears. It has been driving all of us nuts, and we've been trying to standardize it. But finding one where the hub transplant center could communicate HLA information as appropriate to the local spoke and then to the company, right? Things like that. I think the company has to be creative about how they approach it, and also has to go to the spokes, not just the hubs, right? I think that would be key. I just don't know how long that will take, but that's my recommendation.
Thank you. Upton, what would you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, it's those are really great points. I think it's important to recognize that at the moment, patients with refractory or relapsed PTLD are typically almost invariably followed at the hubs. because they have a bunch of other things that are being done, types of investigations that are being done, PET scans, virology monitoring. There are other things that are being done to them. So they're usually at the hubs. It would be highly unlikely that they will be primarily followed in the spokes, if you will. But I can see a scenario where treatment is initiated at the hubs, so to speak, and monitoring or even subsequent, treatments given more peripherally, as long as those peripheral sites could be well plugged in and be equipped to deliver. And so, if this, in terms of the delivery, I would think that this would I can see the potential that this could be delivered through a participation, a collaboration between a hub and spoke model, which is not very easy to do for more toxic types of medications where, one has to be so much more careful with, things that might happen, be those febrile neutropenic complications, low white blood cell counts and fever, and need to treat them, or the breaking down of cells and the, what we call a cytokine storming of events. There are various types of things that would likely not happen in this type of treatment.
Yep. All right. Joe, I'm coming to you. I'll come over to the payers in a second. My assumption is that this will very much start as a hub approach as it first rolls out. And I can't remember how many vials are involved in each treatment. Is it one vial per?
It depends on the patient's weight. I would say
Oh, that's right. That's right.
it's typically one for the kids and maybe 2 or 3 for the adults.
So is it fair to say that each one of those vials is very, very expensive if it gets dropped on the floor? Yes, I'm sure it is.
Well,
So
I think it's a little, I think we're in a different, I would predict, not being employed by the manufacturers, right? I would predict that we should target a price range that is not where CAR T cells are, where you sometimes only have one bag. You may have an extra, but you may not. You drop it on the floor, you're out of luck. And those are genetically modified and they're made unique to each patient, right?
Right.
So these are from a bank. There's no genetic modification. You grow these out against viral proteins, and then you have them stored, and each manufacturing run yields multiple vials. So I think we sort of need to keep the allogeneic off the shelf aspect and the economy of scale here. So we have had things that happen, and we call the company back up, and they have 20 of that vial, right? Not 2,000. And only certain patients will benefit from that lot, but it's not the same as a lot of cellular therapies we've been thinking of in the past.
All right. Thank you for introducing that. I actually really do want to come back to that point about the distinction between CAR T as it has been and this, and what that should imply about the cost structure and the pricing. So we'll come back to that. Joe, thanks for being patient. Please go ahead.
I wanted to pose the question. I through most of my life have dealt with expectations, setting expectations, and I just wanted to get clarification on the issue of once word gets out on any kind of a new drug that's available, patients get excited and they want to find out how they get access to it, whether they're living in a rural community like I'm in, essentially, or they're close to a transplant center in Madison or Chicago or New York. And Grace Lynn used some really critical words that we skated over quickly, which was, and this may be Sarah and Dr. Allen can respond to, the words are, if there's a match. And I'm really curious what that, I mean, this whole HLA thing, the antigen, it is available and it's done annually typically with most transplant patients, and I'm 37 years out now. So this issue of, to me, is like, how many real patients will be able to get this based on that matching issue. So that's critical to me.
No, it's a great question. And I actually raised the question of the ICER team before, whether the HLA matching problems that are found sometimes for African Americans to just get bone marrows and other things, if that somehow translates through to this area. I was told it does not. But Upton or Sarah, what are the questions about access to HLA matched or appropriate treatments here?
Upton, I usually talk first. Why don't you go first on this one and I can follow, unless you want me to go.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important concern. It's I don't know that we have enough data to definitively define the magnitude of the concern, except that we definitely need to recognize the importance of some sort of matching. If not, one, the treatment might not work. Two, is that the cells are cleared too rapidly from the circulation. But even in situations where the matching is not perfect, clinicians might still consider using tab-cel. It's just that the effect might be more short-lived because the cells are being more rapidly cleared from the circulation.
And
Thanks.
I'll
Sarah?
comment that it is something that actually I've asked for in sort of reviewing and was not published in some of the literature in terms of who fell off at what points in time because there was no match. My sense is that it is less than 10%. And what the manufacturers have promulgated is that in general, banks in individual areas, and to my understanding, they're actually creating country or region specific banks based on the HLA diversity that you see in those populations that bank will be serving. Again, this is my impression. And that their goal is by surveying sort of the epidemiology, so to speak, of HLA distribution in the population, and then of the normal donors that are willing to come in. And we do now have in the cell therapy field, not just matching for bone marrow transplant, but actual normal donor banks, right? And you can request just like you can for HLA matched platelets. So the goal that they've had is to create a bank that will cover 95% of that given population. I would imagine that there are some ethnic groups that will not be well represented, right? And there are unique circumstances where people inherit from mom or dad something very similar from the two of them. So, consanguineous families. But I think in general, I would expect greater than 90% of patients to have something. And I think as the banks get more developed, it should be more than 95%. That's what I've heard.
Okay. Well, certainly this may increase the desire to flesh that out from 95 to 100%, given it would be
Absolutely. Yes.
It'd
And
be
for
a
any
shame
given
for
patient,
any given patient, right?
yeah, for any given patient, it's either yes or no, and it's devastating if it's a no. I have been in that situation, yes.
I want to turn to the insurers for a second, but kind of guessing a little bit from something that Sarah said earlier about, again, you talked about it's both working with the manufacturers where there's a lot of diversity and trying to get people on the same page with structures and processes, and it's also the same with payers. And if I'm just going to ask Emily or Melissa, so imagine again, if probably when this gets approved in January, these patients have already been approved and gone through transplant. It's very likely the patients are going to be with the same insurer through that process and now kind of potentially needing this treatment. Could you imagine a world in which the providers are basically gold carded to provide this treatment with a very, very simple prior auth, just around maybe having had first-line treatment, but all the other bells and whistles that would go into a lot of the clinical criteria that we will talk about? If we're interested in trying to reduce barriers to accelerate their access, Do you think that's likely, especially with a treatment of this cost, or do you think that's unlikely? Melissa, maybe start with you.
Great question. So whenever a new cell therapy is approved, there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of questions come up. But what I can say about this, thinking of, let's say, the commercial patients and Medicare as well, and thinking about like drug policies for a medication such as of this, I want to say that oftentimes the policy language for medical necessity for these medications align pretty closely with the FDA indication language and the NCCN compendia language. So it as long as it's used in the right line of therapy, so after failure of primary therapy, right, this is a second line agent, for the most part, and as long as all the medical records are received and that's established, prior treatment history is established, I don't see an issue with providing an approval. You know, one of the benefits, I know this was said previously, there are no like prior chemo that has to be given, like any lymphodepleting agents. There's no, there aren't other medications associated with it. In terms of supportive care agents, I don't see like issues with antiemetics, with growth factors. I want to say it should be relatively straightforward. That's just my perspective from what I've seen with other cell therapies, and thinking about this cell therapy and how many advantages it has in terms of like the fact, like I said, like there are low toxicity, no lymphodepleting. I think another huge benefit is that outpatient administration is very feasible with this agent, and that's huge in the payer section. You know, is something going to be given outpatient? Does something require an inpatient admission, or sometimes it gets complicated when it requires an inpatient admission for a few days, but then the subsequent doses are outpatient. So I think it's a huge benefit that this drug can be given in the clinic.
So thanks. We'll come back because I want to do some of the broader issues first. We'll come back to compare the eligibility criteria for the single pivotal trial with what the FDA label language might be, and we'll talk a bit about whether there'll be a tension between some of those elements. And that's where also the clinical experts will help us understand where they feel like they might themselves or others might want to use it outside of the terms, if you will, of the eligibility criteria in the pivotal trial. So let me go to Emily, and then Sarah, come back to you. So Emily, anything else you would say in general about, you know, how you would anticipate when this comes before your P&T committee, different considerations around. Now, gold carding, by the way, I forgot to define that for some folks. It just means that the health insurer basically exhibits, if you will, confidence or trust in the provider and has a lower burden of prior authorization, less kind of fields to go through, in a sense of feeling that especially if they have a track record of having prescribed and treated patients appropriately, that flows through into a simpler process for this new treatment. But Emily, how do you think it's going to work here?
Yeah, see, that's a really good question. You know, I think that you know, on the whole, it sounds reasonable, but I think that in practice, you know, just with some of the administrative considerations, gold carding is typically handled by a different part of the insurer, a different department versus like the P&T committee. And so, and it's also, I would say, relatively comprehensive process. And so it's typically a process that's done for, you know, more frequent occurrences where you would lower, you know, the barrier for access. And so given the rarity of these situations, I think that unless there's consistent escalations that occur where there's barriers to care that are being met, where it rises to the level of really reaching a concern, and, you know, bring it to the consideration of the group that makes gold carding decisions, I think that it probably would fall under the radar. That would be my guess. And so I think maybe at least at first, insurers might rely on the existing process to ensure access. So like knowing that there is an expedited option for the majority of patients for that prior authorization review, going to what Melissa said about typically the prior authorization criteria being pretty reasonable and consistent across different payers. I think an insurer might rely on the process first before going straight to gold carding, just because of how burdensome of a decision that typically is.
Burdensome inside the payer. I got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good. And again, we'll come back to some of those specific differentiating points between a broad label and the clinical trial eligibility and see which of them might matter most. Sarah, thank you. You've been waiting too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because what I've been hearing from some of our financial clearance groups, and we're a big institution, so we have a lot of resources to devote to this, is some of the newer cell therapies, it can take a month to negotiate a single case agreement for a patient. And obviously that's not acceptable for CAR or TIL patients regardless, but they also have to wait 3 to 4 weeks, right? So we know that only patients without rip-roaring disease are candidates for some of these therapies that inherently require a wait. But I think one of the things that Upton and I have been saying about tab-cel is the ready availability of it in patients who have a rapidly progressing disease is huge. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts? And does the gold carding, which I'm not familiar with the term, mean that this can be turned around in a day or two, right? Because if it can't, then that negates a lot of the benefit of this therapy.
Right. And just to restate what we heard earlier again, which was for patients who relapse, they can die within weeks to 1 to 2 months. That's actually kind of the norm for some of these folks for many of the conditions. So Emily or Melissa, again, internally, that means you get a request for this treatment. Does it fall into a certain bucket of emergency requests that gets triaged within 72 hours? Just how do you want to describe how that works?
Yeah, Steve, I would say that, Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically these centers are familiar with that expedited review or that emergency review option. Unfortunately, just because of the regulatory considerations, like the provider, whoever's filling out the prior authorization, really has to choose that option, but it's usually made very clear in the process that that is an option, and it's typically a 48 to 72 hour turnaround time. For the gold carding, I did want to call out, like, it might, if in a situation where this is a gold carded review, it would expedite the review, but just because of I'll say the bluntness of the prior authorization process on the medical benefit, there's really no great way to, auto adjudicate, or lack of a better word, that prior authorization. So it's more like an operational issue rather than a intent one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm always going to be watching the clock as we go through because I have my hands on all the different questions I'm hoping to get to. Doug, was there anything that you wanted to add about the equity issues? I was going to turn to out-of-pocket costs and how patients are going to deal with the insurance system around this as a kind of add-on treatment to what they're otherwise getting. Was there anything else you wanted to say about equity or things that the system needs to do to kind of introduce this treatment correctly?
I don't have much to add. I would just say that I was, I can imagine how hard it is for someone who doesn't have resources. I was blessed to be in a family, like middle upper class, that could go outside of network, could, get a place near the hospital, could, choose a doctor, and choose hospitals that we wanted to be in. And I couldn't have imagined going through it without or surviving, and getting to the right treatments without that resources. So I just feel blessed and just hope that becomes more equal in the future.
That's something we can bring note to, even though you're right, we're not trying to address, if you will, stepping back and addressing the whole transplant world and how people can access that, which is another incredibly important issue. I think we should try to capture your comments as part of our recommendations. Okay, so let's turn to the price and the cost and how it influences patients. So again, this will be a drug that will be covered under the medical benefit on private insurance or Part B, Baker, for Medicare. And Emily or Melissa, you could comment on this, but a lot of those patients will be paying some either co-payment or possibly a co-insurance on a Part B drug, certainly one this expensive. Any thoughts on ways to help manage that part of the process around access for patients? Maybe they will have already hit their out-of-pocket max given their other care that they'll be receiving. But any thoughts on the structure of Part B or the medical benefit that could help patients with this kind of cost? Emily, what do you think?
Steve, I agree with you. Just given their course, I would expect that they probably have hit their out-of-pocket max, and even if they hadn't, the typical 20% coinsurance on this treatment would get them there. I think the recommendation from most health plans would be to stay in network to keep those costs lower, but I can definitely see situations where that would be a challenge. So I think what I would say is, getting the patient involved in the care management team at the insurer would greatly help expedite some of that discussion, and just weighing the different considerations with the patient. I think that would be my recommendation, but it is a tough one.
Yeah. Melissa,
Maybe
anything? Go ahead.
I share Emily's thoughts here, and just to add, I don't know if there's a way to urge the manufacturers for patient assistance programs here with this medication. I mean, the costs that these patients are experiencing, not just with the Tab-cel, but all along their journey, right? They're perhaps, so one thing I want to say I didn't mention earlier, I did say that I work at OncoHealth, but prior to my working here at OncoHealth, I worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering in the pediatric stem cell department, and saw patients receiving these EBV T cells. So just thinking of the patient's journey and from a cost perspective, now that I'm in managed care, I think of, like, for example, a patient with a leukemia who had all their treatments associated with leukemia, then their transplant, potentially issues with GVHD, and needing to see specialists for whatever, infectious disease, ophtho, all these different specialists other than their actual transplant doctor. All these costs add up, additional scans, PT, OT, not being able to go to school. I worked with pediatrics, so maybe having homeschool. There's so many additional costs involved in this Tab-cel, it is another cost. So it's a patient that's not, it's a patient population that is not new to treatment. They've had a lot, right? They've had a lot in their history. So at least from the heme standpoint, it was where my perspective comes from. So being able to have some sort of like patient assistance programs in place from the manufacturer, I think would be paramount for these patients.
Sarah, do you have any comment on that from the hospital perspective? Do you anticipate patients looking you and saying, oh gosh, again, I have to pay that much out of pocket for something like this? Of course, they're going to want to do it. Any thoughts on best practices to try to reduce the barriers, the financial toxicity?
I think patient assistant programs are huge. I think that the patients right now for whom this therapy would be considered have no other options, and will, unless it's going to actually bankrupt their family and they're willing to sacrifice themselves for their loved ones, I think they will want to pay. The patient assistance programs are going to be key. I think one of the things we were talking about accessibility was, as opposed to other cell therapies like CARs, where under REMS programs, you have to stay within close proximity, as defined differently for each product, for a month. You're not allowed to drive for 2 months, right? Again, this is so different that I think that the costs for the drug are not accompanied by all of these other costs and burden on the caregivers that we've had with some of the other therapies, right? So I think it will be an issue. I think people will be desperate to pay, but I think patient assistance will be huge. And luckily, we don't expect that you will need to have the companies asked to cover lots of transportation and hospitalizations and things like that.
Right. And I don't think this was mentioned earlier in the day, but when you add up the cumulative costs of 2 to 3 cycles, and again, we don't know the price, and I really, all we have to do is go on as one analyst's prediction, if you
Yep.
will. But, we're talking about 2 to 3 times
Yep.
around $250,000. So we're talking, north of 500,000 for many patients here, and that's without considering the add-on administration fee from the provider or whatever else it might be. So this is a lot of money, and it's not that many patients. So a lot of people would say this is to get a drug that's this transformative in its effect on length of life for so many patients with this condition, and only have a couple hundred. This is part of the equation. This is part of the way that we get innovation and get to yes, but it doesn't mean that it solves the affordability problems in the short term for providers, for payers, and certainly for patients. So let's go forward and talk about the coverage policies specifically, and I'll mainly think about the private insurer coverage policies. And here again, it seems to me like one of the big issues, and we might as well tackle it now, is the fact that the trials and the European approval were all around patients who had already been tried on rituximab, and or CHOP to some extent. And so that's very likely going to be the FDA label. Can't really imagine that it would be otherwise. Clinicians, do you anticipate everybody just saying that's the way it's got to be, or do you anticipate from day one that you'll be trying to get an exception to be able to use this treatment for people first line? Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Given the data, and again, remember that I operate in the stem cell transplant realm, right? And there has been some question about, despite the small ends, is this therapy differentially, right, effective in solid organ transplant versus HSCT? So our experience with the data and anecdotally is such that I gotta say, I would be tempted to use it. But let me preface that with Rituxan is immediately available, not a few days away, right? So Rituxan is immediately available, is readily, it's relatively easy to give, although there are infusion reactions. And for those who don't know, it's usually dosed once a week for 4 weeks, right? So that part of, I think, what factors into this, and we even on some of these trials, although it may have been expanded access, we petitioned the manufacturer to say, we don't have time to give the other therapies, right, a chance to work. So I think that there will be, most patients will at least get started on Rituxan. I think the question of how long the clinicians will be willing to wait if someone has very rapid disease before they request or try something else is a valid one. And I think that on the trials, the eligibility criteria for patients who were not chemo eligible, they could go directly from Rituxan to Tab-cel. That chemo eligible was in the eye of the beholder, right? So that I could say to the company, my patient has a sternal wound infection from her lung transplant for cystic fibrosis, right? And they didn't say, well, what's the kidney function? What's the liver function? What's the this? So my hope is that even if clinicians try to use it in the relapsed refractory setting, that there will be recognition from the manufacturer and the payers that certain patients may need this a little sooner and may be deemed ineligible for standard therapies in a way that is harder to codify, right? And I see
Yep.
Melissa shaking her head, right? It's hard because you want to go by trial eligibility criteria, but even that left a lot to physician discretion, and I'm hoping that we can maintain that.
That's a great.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. I think that there will be, first of all, it's important to remember that at least if we start with the solid organ transplant patients to begin with, the first step in managing PTLD is to minimize or even in some cases stop your immunosuppression. So depending on feasibility and how much elbow room you have in terms of safety, one cuts back on immunosuppressions. That's the first step. But there are some types of PTLD where rituximab would not work. It's a CD20 negative PTLD. Rituximab is not going to work. There are also some other types of PTLDs as well, where one would want to go to chemotherapy much sooner, but then, as Sarah's alluded to, there may be reasons why chemotherapy might not be desirable. And so in those situations, on a case-by-case basis, I can see clinicians wanting to consider tab-cel earlier on the sequence rather than later on. There's this one thing I just wanted to add to an earlier comment about patient support from the company, the manufacturer. I think it's important to recognize that once patients are started on treatment, because the number of folks who've been involved in the clinical trial really is so relatively small, new patients are still providing valuable information in real time that is going to be beneficial to everyone, to the physicians, to clinicians more broadly, to the manufacturer, and to other patients. And I think that that's a good reason for companies to try to recognize that and to support patients wherever they can, because after all, they're actually helping to generate useful information.
Great, thanks. And now maybe Melissa, did you want to respond to what Sarah and Upton were just saying?
Yeah, so am I on mute? No.
Yes, you're on mute.
Going back to the concept of the FDA language, perhaps that's still to be determined, right? What the exact FDA language will be, whether it's they stay in the relapse refractory setting, and you both bring up excellent points about some patients not being eligible to receive that upfront chemo, whether it be because they're not CD20 positive or because they have comorbidities that preclude them from the use of chemo. I think those are things that can be covered either in a peer-to-peer or in the policy language. The policy language doesn't always completely mimic the FDA language. Components of the registration trial can be incorporated into a policy, and it can include information such as what you said in patients who are not eligible for chemotherapy. There has to be like some sort of I guess maybe exceptions for those situations. And because those patients were covered in the registration trial, you do have patients who were not eligible. We can't say that we have peer-reviewed CMS-approved journals that contain that patient population, right? So I think that works to provide support to justify the medication for those chemo ineligible patients.
Great, thanks. Emily, did you want to say anything about that as well? We'll come again to some more specific issues around the trial eligibility, but anything in general right now?
No, I agree with what Melissa said. And, I think that in this case specifically, most payers typically have a specialist available. So you might even be able to tackle some of these considerations on that first review. It might get bumped up to the specialist and they would see those considerations, and you may not have to go to peer-to-peer.
Okay, great. So let me handle, again, I know this seems like it's in the weeds a bit, but this is where some of the friction happens, is where, payers have to write a black and white policy that says what's, allowed to provide coverage. And in how that language is worded, again, can come a lot of flexibility or very tight kind of considerations. But before I even did that, I thought I would just read the label from the European Medicines Agency, where it was approved a couple years ago, just so we have some reference point. The treatment called Ebvallo over there is indicated as monotherapy for treatment of adult and pediatric patients 2 years of age and older with relapsed or refractory EBV PTLD, excuse me, who have received at least one prior therapy. They didn't say what prior therapy, they said one prior therapy. And it does say for solid organ transplant patients, prior therapy includes chemotherapy unless chemotherapy is inappropriate. So that's what the Europeans have been working from in the past. And let's start in terms of how an American insurer would write this policy. They frequently start with diagnosis, and I don't think there are going to be any questions about criteria for diagnosis here. Then they often talk about age, the age range. Now, at least as I understand it, the clinical trials did not include pediatric population, did not include pediatric patients. They were all over the age of 18. We don't know if the FDA will therefore say it's approved in adults and not specify that it's approved for pediatric cases as well. But Upton, let me clearly ask you, you probably have an opinion on this. Should the FDA approve this for pediatric patients, even if there were none in the trial?
Yeah, I believe so. The factors that would relate to differences between adults and children are probably not there to suggest that one shouldn't extrapolate to kids. I think so. What are some of those factors? So the pathogenesis of PTLD, whether it's in kids or adults, once individuals are at risk, it's pretty more or less the same. Primary infection in kids, primary infection in adults. There are some differences in terms of individuals who were EBV seropositive before transplant and yet still got PTLD, but that's a subset. In primary PTLD, where individuals are EBV negative, and then they get transplanted, then get primary infection. Kids or adults, the similarities outweigh differences. I think where the differences might lie relate to the toxicity profile. But based on the signals that are coming through from adults, we're not seeing any signals that would suggest that, wow, raise a red flag as far as the kids are concerned. So I think that based on the information that we have from the adult experience, as pediatricians, we would think that we have enough to want to extrapolate to children in this situation where our backs are against the wall, so to speak. There are no other options, and it's an issue of weighing risks versus benefits, and recognizing that kids, the outcome from PTLD, that's untreated, is really quite devastating. Issues around the availability of organs for retransplant, for example, in solid organ transplant situations, big problem in kids, perhaps even more so than adults. So I think we would, the risk-benefit scenario would suggest that we would likely want to see it approved for use in kids as well.
Okay, that was very well stated. And actually, I received a chat during your answer that let me know that I was mistaken, that actually
You are mistaken.
eligibility criteria did include children, and there were 6 children.
The latest paper that came out on the allele study, there were 11 patients less than 18 years of age.
Okay, so I take it all back. Children are likely going to be part of the label. So let's now drill down. There are 2 I noticed in the inclusion criteria from the allele trial, and Sarah and others keep me honest still. They do say for that trial you had to have treatment failure of rituximab or rituximab plus any concurrent or sequentially administered chemotherapy regimen. So a lot of payers in the US will read that and consider just cutting and pasting that in, even if the FDA label just says treatment of EBV positive PTLD. So that's there. We can talk about it. But the other two that I wanted to get the clinical experts again to comment on, one is ECOG performance status less than or equal to 3. That means that if you are in bed, you're disabled entirely by your condition, you're in bed. I think even one of you talked about patients who might be on a respirator or something. You were not eligible for the trial, and it says adequate organ function was a requirement to get into the trial. Should payers in the US include those criteria as part of their coverage? Would that be a big mistake from your perspective as a clinical expert? What say you?
So can I speak as a clinician, not necessarily a clinical expert? So as you guys can imagine, clinical trials have to be designed with relatively reasonable thresholds, especially if it's not a phase 1 trial, right? But it's a phase 3 trial or a phase 2 trial with reasonably strict entry criteria so that you can detect a toxicity or an efficacy signal above what the underlying, this sounds crass, but protoplasm, right, of the patient is.
Right.
So that in these settings, there were criteria. You also, starting off the trial, have a sense, but don't have the data to say this is safe, right? So I would say that because the trial data that we have to date does not show that tab-cel impacts kidney function, that tab-cel negatively impacts liver function. Tab-cel, they're even, right, I'm looking at the eligibility criteria, platelet count requirements, right? Tab-cel doesn't really drop the platelet count. So in my mind, the eligibility criteria for the trial are less relevant here in this scenario than they might be for a higher toxicity therapy like CAR T cells, where I do believe the payers went through the trial eligibility criteria and quoted it, right? But there, those patients can have liver and kidney damage from the chemotherapy plus CAR. They do have count drops from chemotherapy plus CAR, right? So there, that entry criteria made a little more sense to maintain given the risk benefit and known toxicities of the drug regimen, right? I think we're in a different scenario here. And I would bet, and Melissa and Emily can correct me, but over time, we have real world data that patients with lower kidney function can survive CAR therapy quite well and benefit from it, right? We've expanded, and some patients with central nervous system involvement have been treated with CAR, which were excluded on the trials. So I see that there's some instances where trial, you stick with it, and then over time, you see if the real world evidence justifies opening. This seems like a different scenario to me, but I'd be interested to hear what the payers, and obviously the FDA will be the final arbiter, but I think it's different.
This is exactly why I wanted to ask you, because we always, as you noted, find that there's a difference between what clinicians think is important to consider in whether a patient is appropriate and what the clinical trial eligibility criteria were for all the reasons that you mentioned and some others even. So let's take that as kind of as the view from the clinician, clinical expert side. Again, Emily or Melissa, how do you think it will be translated through? If the FDA, again, has relatively broad language, do you think payers are likely to want to use these eligibility criteria?
That's a great question, and it's really funny because this is something I was actually having a conversation with a colleague at my company earlier this morning about including ECOG status and organ function status in medical necessity policies. So when I think about this, thinking of what the worst situation would be from a payer would be like denying the medication, right? So if, let's say, the language of ECOG of 0 to the patient needs to have an ECOG of 0 to 2 to be eligible. I'm just kind of making that up. Let's say that was in the policy, but let's say the patient didn't have that ECOG status. Could we deny that medication because they don't have that ECOG status? I don't think that would hold strongly, that denial. I think ECOG status is something that can change. It might be documented in one note as like an ECOG of 1. Maybe the next note might be an ECOG of 2. Like those are things that can vary. And on the payer side, we don't have eyes on this patient. We're not a treating we're not physically actually treating these patients. So I think that's a tough one to incorporate and like hold to it as like your one criteria, as one of the criteria for really like deciding whether you're going to approve or deny a medication. So I would probably not lean on, I probably would lean on leaving ECOG out. And with organ function as well, I feel like that's tricky because when, at least I'm just giving my perspective from my company, we're not, for other cell therapies, we're not necessarily looking at PFTs, LFTs, creatinine clearances, GFRs, all that stuff for adequate organ function. That is presumed to be already cleared by their treating transplant doctor or physician at the time that they were deemed a candidate for cell therapy. So those aren't necessarily things that I would think would be a strong basis to deny a therapy based on a policy. There are certain things that I think are left to a treating provider, a treating physician, and I think ECOG, organ function, we kind of, at least from where I am from, we presume and infer that has been established by the doctor who is treating this patient and administering these cells and monitoring the patient and caring for them.
Right. No, that's the perspective. Now, again, I'm not trying to create a defense for some payer behavior, but we do know that at least in some parts of their business world, they are judged by how tough they are with their prior authorization with high-cost therapies. And one way that they are judged is literally how many questions do they ask of the provider before they will say yes to something that's very expensive. That's an incredibly blunt way to try to show that somebody is being evidence-based or, tough, if you will. But that is part of their world. And that's one of the reasons that we like to talk about these, because we love to highlight where there's a real clinical reason that some of these should not be on the insurance list at all. And, for the reasons that Sarah mentioned in particular. So I want to talk about repeat dosing, which is also going to be an issue for insurers, but I want to hear from Upton first.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that from a clinician's perspective, if the end organ failure or dysfunction that is present in the patient is not plausibly likely to be associated with Tab-cel or be made worse by Tab-cel. It's likely that clinicians would use Tab-cel, and the only reason why they wouldn't would be if the use of Tab-cel would result in a more rapid decline or passage to death compared with not treating. So I think that again, it boils down to risk versus benefits. And as Sarah has alluded to, in clinical trials, it's, as you all know, it's the criteria are often very strict because one wants to make sure that one removes any possibility that adverse events might be inappropriately attributed to the medication, to the criteria tight.
Okay, completely agree. Completely
Yeah.
agree. Okay, sensitive of time, because we do want to talk, I'd love to talk a little bit about the research agenda too, but one more coverage issue. So the clinical trial had a maximum of 4 cycles. Clinical experts, I keep kind of turning to you, but again, imagine this is now FDA approved, you're treating patients. Do you think there will be none, some, a lot of situations in which a patient would benefit from more than 4 cycles, or would need to come back? Let's say they got 2 cycles and then a year later they need 2 or 3 more. I mean, what's that going to look like in the real world, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the way the treatments of our patients work is that clinicians always want to, they feel more comfortable having the option of recycling, if you will, So no two patients are going to be, behaving the same. And so what happens then if you give a cycle, an initial cycle, and 6 to 8 months later, PTLD comes back? Do you give up at that point, or do you give another attempt at a treatment? And those are clinical decisions. And so I think that it would be great if clinicians had that flexibility to exercise that option by the bedside when needed.
I understand that instinct. Emily or Melissa, and Sarah, I'll give you a chance to, but quickly, just given my time, I wonder if Emily or Melissa has a reaction. Again, the tension here is that this is another cycle would be $500,000. What kind of structures does coverage set up to hopefully allow for some consideration of the flexibility that Upton was describing? What's it going to look like, do you think?
So this is a tough question because I've seen this question come up with other cell therapies. However, I do see how this would be a unique situation and different than other cell therapies where more infusions of cells could be needed in the future. But from a payer standpoint, if the clinical trial stopped at a certain amount of cycles, that might be the information that they go with in terms of coverage. Emily, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, but
Yeah, I would agree. I think it gets really tough once there's no evidence available for additional cycles.
Yeah.
I could see a situation where maybe there's an exception made, but I think that is a much tougher issue.
is there data that's published that shows patients getting more cycles? Because if that could possibly be used to justify the need.
I'm laughing because I need to write up this case report, but I think that
Maybe more than a case report.
I think that probably what you would have is case reports, because for those of you who are not as familiar with the allele trial, there was sort of, if you had a complete response, you went one cycle beyond that, right? If you had a partial response, I think it was 2 cycles. And then you had the option, if things were not working out optimally, and there was a second line available, because there's an algorithm to say, this is your best line, but you may have 2 that look good. So there was an option to switch, right? So that in my mind, the premise that the number of cycles is based on response, I think is a reasonable one. The ability to switch within 1 or 2 cycles, if you're not getting the response you want, I would love to see maintained. The case report I am writing up is a patient who didn't specifically have a PTLD. She had a post-transplant smooth muscle tumor, not a lymphoma, driven by EBV. And in her, whenever we treated, it would get better. And whenever we stopped, it would get worse. So she was an unusual situation, not the typical PTLD where we did treat longer. But I can be honest as a clinician and say, I'd love to be able to treat like the trial based on response, have the option to switch one line of therapy. I think beyond that, I got to be honest as a clinician, I'd greedily love more for my patients if it were doing more harm. And I thought there was a little good, but I think it's reasonable to establish some guidelines at that point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's reasonable, but it's important to also recognize the nature of PTLD is such that when relapse occurs, it's not always a true relapse. It's like another case of PTLD. And the nature of PTLD is such that you can have a lesion in one area and another lesion in another area, and they're totally different in terms of the histopathology. So the initial treatment that works, that is followed by a quote unquote relapse several months later, might actually, that second episode might actually be in essence, a different, disease. And so clinicians will be faced with those types of case by case scenario basis and scenarios, and they'll have to decide, well, in those unique circumstances, do I, quote unquote, throw the towel in at that point? What are my options? And their options might be limited. So they may come back to be asking for access to tab-cel.
Well, we will note that, and I think what we'll probably be able to do is just to note the tension that will raise around the evidence of patients who are treated that way and the obvious additional costs. But from a clinician's perspective, I certainly understand what you're saying. All right, I want to make sure I give you guys adequate time to have a final statement, if you will. But and our research staff has already come up with a short list of important research questions for the future, the next generation of research on tab-cel and PTLD. But I'd like to give you each, actually a couple of you, a chance to say what would be the single most important study that could be done over the next 2 to 3 years that would really help move the field forward in terms of the gaps in evidence we have today. And I actually want to start with the patient experts. You guys have been listening to the discussion around the evidence all day. You've heard, this discussion this afternoon, obviously. You may not have any specific ideas of research, but you might. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what you think might need to be done to learn more about what matters to patients in the treatment of PTLD. Doug, can I start with you?
I just want to say it's been fascinating to listen to everybody. It's incredible to kind of step back into this world. I mean, you guys have thought about this way more than I have. I guess the one thing that has come up is around, as I talked about toxicity, when it comes to like my experience of rituximab going, and that was like very toxic to me. And then going into, the sort of tab-cel, which was not toxic and saved me. So I guess I just would like to see more studies that basically bring tab-cel before earlier, and so even flipping those to start with tab-cel and then go to rituximab or to have that as an option because it just feels like there's potentially less side effects and that's all I gotta say. And thank you.
Doug, you can sign yourself up as a consultant in the field because that is the #1 topic that came forth from people who've been studying this area for a long time. And I'm glad to hear that from your personal perspective, that is a key question because a lot of people think you're absolutely right. I'm glad that aligns. Joe, is there anything else that you would want to highlight as things we need to know? I'm sorry.
Yeah, this sounds so well defined in terms of prescribing the drug for the patient who has PTLD. And my experience, which is dissimilar from a lot of people who have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, is that you go through this period of 6 to 8 months or more when it's really difficult to get a diagnosis. And you have this fatigue and night sweats and all this other stuff. You're totally confused. So you personally are not in a good position to help yourself. And a lot of times falls on the caregiver. I'm not really sure how to articulate this properly, but it sounds, if you're at the transplant center and you've been identified as a PTLD and you have large B cell, then you have this. And when I had this is almost 10 years ago, there were no other options. It was CHOP or nothing. So I think it's great, particularly that you wouldn't have to have Hickman or that kind of thing and have to go through all that awful kind of experience. But I'm just trying to figure out how do you get to these people who are not really prescribed in terms of having had that identification in the transplant center. And, it seems like there's a large group out there that is not identified. And I don't know how you do that. You're dealing with your general practitioner and,
You're right. There are a lot of having practiced as a primary care doctor. I know how hard it is to keep track of all these kind of new things and what's out there. But I will note that because we do need to make sure that the system figures out how to share broader knowledge and experience, whether it's a hub and spoke approach or whatever we do. But your point's very well taken. Thank you. Clinical experts, one study, what would you want to have done in the next 2 to 3 years to answer the most important question in the field? Sarah?
So one is commenting on the education piece. I think that is huge. I think that again, going back to CAR T cells, there has been lots of promotion, but also professional societies have hosted educational webinars, have put things on their websites in terms of education. So I think that emphasizing that these therapies are approved and out there is important. I absolutely agree. I got to be honest, the most important thing I think is sort of doing my research background, giving my research background no credit. I want to emphasize the real world experience and how important that is, right? Because on a smaller trial where probably there were not tons of centers, I'd have to look back at how many centers. I think the question is, what is the efficacy and safety going to look like in the real world as people push the envelope, right, on which patients they put on? They don't necessarily comply with the stricter trial eligibility. And how are we using it, right? Your question of, do we go beyond 4? Is that happening? I think that really how we use this in sequencing in different patients can only be answered by accumulating that real world data.
Brilliant. Brilliant. All right, Upton?
Yeah,
What do you
no,
think?
this is a great question. One of the challenges when you have a medication that is seen as a potentially a Hail Mary kind of thing, you have some patients who do well and some don't, and in some cases it can be like flipping a coin, and so I would think that the key thing is to try to use this agent in a population of individuals with a high probability of success and perhaps cure, which would mean an earlier intervention. And along the lines of I believe Joe mentioned earlier, in that regard, when you think about the first step in the management of PTLD, it's actually restoring T cell function by reducing immunosuppression. And giving tab-cel is consistent with that same theme. So an earlier studies that look at earlier use with or without rituximab, with reduction of immunosuppression, I think that would be really important to do.
All right, fantastic. That will make a very rich part of our policy recommendations. Each of the ideas that you guys brought up was really, really helpful. Okay, now, as I think you all know, we like to end this part of the policy roundtable with a chance for you to have a final statement. And we do ask that it be one sentence. And I like to say that sentence can include commas. It can include a strategically placed semicolon. If you remember what that is, old people like I used to use semicolons. I think they've disappeared from the lexicon these days. And it can be either something that has already been said, you've already said that you just want to really hit again. It can be something that has been missing from the conversation that you want to make sure gets included at the end. And I would also encourage you to think of it as a possibility of making a request of one of the stakeholders here or the drug maker who decided not to participate, a request for some action that they could take that would be really important in improving innovation, affordability, and access for these kinds of treatments. So I'm going to let the patients go last in this part of the session, and maybe I can ask Emily to kick us off.
Steve, I just wanted to say thank you to the patient experts for just all of the great information that they've provided. And I strongly encourage payers to reach out to their hubs that they contract with to come to an agreement about reimbursement. And I strongly encourage the hubs that to reach out proactively to the payers that they contract with to reach an agreement to avoid single case agreements where we are under a time crunch and it's very stressful.
All right, thank you. That's good advice. Melissa?
Thank you for this opportunity. I just want to express my excitement with this medication and this cutting edge. I mean, such a great data that was presented. Thank you so much to the patient experts. I mean, your testaments are just really moving and really appreciated in this setting. And from the payer standpoint, just hoping that we can provide as much support so that prior authorizations are moved as quickly as possible. To clinicians, please mark those as stat cases so that on the payer side we can process those and get those turned around so that there are minimal, the most minimal delays, if any, and there's no impact or negative impact to patient care or delays with treatment. And to the manufacturers, I know they're not here, but maybe they'll see this in writing someplace, to hope that they can provide patient assistance so that patients can actually afford these agents and somehow provide patient education to rural areas so that more patients are aware and can get these therapies.
Great, thank you again.
Lots of comments.
Lots of commas. It's allowed. It's allowed.
Okay.
Sarah?
Recognizing my enthusiasm for this that has stretched over decades, I would request that discussions like this happen, including these same stakeholders plus the manufacturer, as the hoped FDA approval comes out and as implementation rolls out, so that we can optimize access and investigate the different models of delivery we talked about while preserving safety, but also a little bit of flexibility, recognizing that each patient with this disease does have a different personal and clinical journey. So these conversations should continue to happen. This is how we're going to successfully get this rolled out to people.
Here, here. Thank you very much. Upton?
You know, I would say that with the clinical trial findings of the clinical trial, the sample size is small. It's clear that there's benefit, and the benefits were seen in a population of patients who had advanced disease. So it would seem to me that if now I'm going to say if cost is not an issue, but okay, let's put that in parentheses. But it would seem to me that the impact of the drug would be greater if used sooner in the patient's journey rather than at a later stage in their journey. And so it's that issue of balancing the cost, the affordability with use earlier on rather than waiting until we have advanced disease or refractory disease.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, patients, the last word. Joe, let me go with you first this time.
I would say that the most important thing is it's really exciting news, and that anybody that faces this dilemma would be really, really excited about the opportunity to use the drug. And I think the challenge is going to be to, once it gets approved, figure out a way to do this patient education. But before you can do that, you have the whole medical community and infrastructure to deal with. So whether it's transplant surgeons or certainly with the hub approach sounds like it makes a lot of sense. But I would just say again that having lived through the CHOP procedure, that this really offers something terribly exciting and very, very productive for a patient that faces these kinds of challenges.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And Doug.
Yeah, just thank you all. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. Super exciting, and just to, thank you all so much for dedicating your lives to this work. For patients like me and Joe and our families, and we're here because of it. So just keep it up, and so grateful for all y'all. So thanks.
That's a lovely sentiment, and we're certainly very appreciative of your participation, Joe, yours, and all of you guys on the Policy Roundtable. To echo Sarah, and I'll have a final statement at the very end, but I just want to thank you because this kind of conversation is exactly what these meetings are about, as a part of the bookend, if you will, with a hard look, a clear-eyed look at the evidence itself. This is really important to continue going forward. So thank you very much. I hope you can stay to hear the final statements from the members of the CEPAC. You will likely hear a lot of praise for your participation and what they've learned from you. Let me hand it back over to the chair of the CEPAC, Jason Wasfy.
Thank you all for such a interesting and informative policy roundtable. So as Steve was referencing at the very end, Steve has referenced these run-on sentences, which I've learned from Steve very much about over the years, about how to pack a lot of thoughts into one sentence. We'd ask for one sentence from each member of the New England CEPAC. And just the same way I did at the very beginning, I will start in alphabetical order with Dr. Austin Fracht.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm very grateful for this meeting and all the participants. Thank you for the clinical experts and the patients, and ICER for your work. And I don't have anything else to add. So just thank you very much. It's been a good meeting.
Thank you. Dr. George Goswami.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's been a privilege to learn from all of you today. Some take homes for me, just thinking about how this team wrestled with the net health benefits and the level of certainty, which is always such an important discussion. But I'll be very specific in the context of taking care of folks with lymphoma, and of course with our clinical experts with PTLD here today. It's very nice to be able to have that conversation essentially when I think Dr. Allen referred to this as kind of having your back against the wall a little bit, right? When you're the physician taking care of the patient and you really have no other options. So I would be very interested moving forward to see if this therapy could be used sooner, echoing what Dr. Allen said. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for your great comment. Rebecca Kirsch.
I'll just echo the gratitude for the thoughtful conversation today. I thought it was very meaningful, especially the special consideration questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. That's my first time moderating the special consideration questions, so thank you. Dr. Steve Kogan.
Great. As well, my thanks to all. I'd say, it's too bad we didn't have a price, because I think discussion and maybe landing on a position on the value for money question is really an important aspect of ICER's process. And certainly a lot of effort went into modeling that. But as I said before, I think this is an example of a true innovation that should be rewarded to the extent that pricing is not way out of line, but we shall see.
Thanks, Steve. Don Kreis.
Thank you. One sentence, here it comes. Shout outs from me to 3 people, the 2 patient experts who deserve my congratulations and high regard for having contributed so many insights and for their thriving over many decades now post-transplant. And also shout out to Sarah as the clinical expert, because she is exactly the kind of doctor I would love to be my doctor or the doctor to one of my loved ones, based on her articulateness, her enthusiasm, and her clinical insight, even though something she said to the effect that patient assistance programs are going to be key prompts me to say, sort of following up on what I just heard from Dr. Kogut, that a fair price for this drug is really, really important. And so I hope the manufacturer in particular has read every word ICER has put out and listened to every word said today, because the fact that we didn't get to take a vote on long-term value for money doesn't mean that affordability and reasonableness of price are not critical issues.
Thank you, Don. And I always find the lawyers can actually pack the most content into one. So
They taught us that in law school. What can I say?
setting the bar high. Dr. Julie Coopers.
I just want to echo everyone's sentiments here. I'm honored to have been a part of this discussion with this esteemed group. Tab-cel appears to be a novel cell therapy that really has the potential to make a substantial impact. And like everyone, I look forward to learning more about the options for patients in terms of both access and cost. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Aaron Mitchell.
I know I've had a bad connection today, so I hope this comes through clearly, but it's great to be a part of ICER in general and see our appropriately high standards for clinical evidence, and hence also exciting to see a treatment that can meet that and achieve our highest evidence rating in the context of a one-arm trial, which is a pretty high bar to meet. And at the same time, interesting to see a treatment that both very clearly meets an unmet need, but then does not meet that unmet need because we've still got half of patients who don't respond, and we need to keep working on that as well.
Thank you, Aaron, and we heard you perfectly. So thank you for saying that. Dr. Brian O'Sullivan.
Yeah, once more, kudos to everyone who took part, and especially the patient experts and the clinical experts. This is an amazing therapy, I think. I wanted to echo what Aaron just said, that I do worry about the half of people who don't respond, so there's more to be done. But this is great work, and I'd love to see this go forward for everyone. And as a personal note, parenthetically, if I can put a parenthesis in too, Steve, Don, you do not want Sarah to be your doctor because you don't want to have any of the diseases that she takes care of.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Joe Porter.
Yeah, I just want to say again, thanks to everybody. And it's a good reminder that we need all of the perspectives collectively to be able to take some really good science into practical ways to implement them, because in the absence of that, we may have created something that's incredibly exciting clinically and completely out of reach for people practically. So I appreciate the depth of the conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Joe Ross.
Not anything more really to add, but did want to express my thanks for everyone for their participation. I learned a lot from listening to all of you, and especially want to thank the clinical experts and the patients, and Jason, you and ICER staff for coordinating such a great meeting.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Dr. Jason Schwartz.
Thanks, Jason, and to everyone who put together today's meeting, all the hard work behind it. I always learn a great deal new at these meetings, even as we on the CEPAC confront familiar, similar issues and challenges around evidence and value, how to measure it, how to evaluate it, and how to translate it into policy and practice. You know, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for this drug. I think it sounds like it's well-founded, and hopeful that the challenges that we've heard about, education, access, and affordability, will be confronted because there's an important opportunity ahead. So thank you to all.
Thank you, Jason. Dr. Rishi Wadera.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone, especially the patient experts, Joseph and Doug. I thought your insights were really, really valuable and important to the overarching discussions. And thank you to Dr. Nikiforou and Dr. Allen. It's just really wonderful to have discussions like this that sort of bring evidence appraisal to the discussion from folks like me. I'm a cardiologist. I do not take care of these patients, and then integrate that with the clinical insights of people who actually take care of these patients every day and have a lot of experience doing so. I think that it's very valuable along with the patient insights. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Rishi. I guess I'm the only one left, so I would just like to express a lot of gratitude to my colleagues on the CEPAC, first of all, because as you've seen today, there's tremendous diversity of expertise. Some of us have a health services background, otherwise clinical backgrounds. There's patient experts. There's expertise from all different lenses, and so we know that these reports they're extraordinarily detailed, they're extraordinarily long, they bring tremendous rigor, and we're able to digest them and engage the ICER research staff with important questions and objectively assess the ratings in a really rigorous and respectful way. The work ahead of us, the work that we do is so important. This is about sick patients needing new therapies and unmet needs, and how to deliver those therapies for individuals in ways that doesn't involve friction and is respectful of the constrained resources that we have in any healthcare system. So I'm grateful to be on this journey with you. And the very last thing I'll say is that this is my first time, despite my years on this panel, moderating the questions. So I express specific gratitude to Steve Pearson for all the things I've learned from him over the years. I'm not sure I'm ever going to get to the point where I'm as good at moderating questions as you have been, but I hope you know how grateful so many of us are for all you've done for American medicine over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was lovely. And again, congrats to you. Believe me, you've been around long enough to see me stumble through a number of voting sessions, and there was blood on the floor. So you did great with today, and we'll continue to enjoy that. I also want to thank the Policy Roundtable participants, the ICER research staff, who I thought produced a brilliant report, and you, the CEPAC. Again, I just can't tell you how central your role is to what we hope to accomplish with this entire effort. And through the years, people sometimes have asked, why is it so important to try to save money if some drugs are too expensive? We're always trying, and sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But yeah, we throw a lot of money out there. And what's the whole point of trying to save money and on some drugs? And I love having examples like this one, where this innovation, again, we don't know the price, fair enough, but it certainly represents a tremendous clinical innovation of great benefit to patients. And the unmet need that we talked about, just the step change in what this will bring to the care of patients with this condition, and its potential to be applied to other areas, other types of conditions. It's all that we want in innovation. And to have the resources to do this and to do it right, we have to, I think, obviously be smart about how we kind of manage the rest of the health system and the rest of the treatments and other kinds of things we do. So this kind of discussion is, as Sarah, I think, was very lovely in pointing out, it can't just happen once. It has to continue, and it has to be something that involves everybody. But CEPAC, you bring a really unique combination of insight into the clinical trial aspects, the benefits beyond health, as we call them, and the kind of policy context and the broader issues. It becomes part of a very rich conversation. So as Jason kind of alluded to, this is going to be the last meeting that I will moderate the Policy Roundtable. And we'll be having other discussion about that in the future. But just for fun, in case you really want to wonder how long I've been doing this, let's see if I can figure this out. All right, give me 2 secs, because it's me and a computer. And where is that thing? All right. So let me see what you can see. All right, you see that young man right there? That's what 17 years will do to you. It's not a pretty thing. It's not a pretty thing. But that's a New England CEPAC meeting in the year 2007. And I will say that I'm very proud of the journey that we've all been on together, what we've learned together, and the work that we continue to do for patients. God, it looks like I'm wearing the exact same pair of glasses. That's embarrassing. No fashion statement whatsoever. But I just want to thank all of you for supporting me and ICER through this journey, which continues on under great leadership and tremendous staff, and our relationships with our CEPAC and with the people who participate in our meetings, our patient experts, the clinical experts, and the payer representatives, and we hope increasingly the manufacturers. It's critical to the ethical heart of our future as a healthcare system. So thank you today for everybody's participation, and I wish you very well.
Thank you.